and then we'll go through this week's assignments as well, so everybody's on board with exactly what's taking place. For some reason, it's not letting me do this. Let's see if it lets me do it now. Okay, all right. All right, so our first chapter, we're going to talk a little bit about basic reports. We're going to hit a little bit on some things that are kind of needed with reports. Remember, police report writing is going to be a little bit different. It's quite a bit more factual, and it's short and to the point. It's not like on a dark and gloomy night kind of aspect. And then we're going to talk a little bit about police jargon and what police jargon actually is. Law enforcement uses a lot of codes and a lot of different things, and some slang and things like that. So we want to stay away from that as we're writing our reports, because a lot of individuals don't know what that means. So for the lecture tonight, for the first half, we want to be able to enhance the knowledge and understanding of, English, the language, as it applies to completing, police reports. So it's a little bit different, as I said. Look at some of the procedural issues when you write a report. Understand the different style and flow and content of a police report. And then we'll have a couple of little exercises as we're going through. But that's kind of on tap for our first lecture. And one of the big things that really I want to point out right away before we start is this particular case law. And this case law is Brady versus Maryland. And, it's back in 1963, but it's really important because it's a landmark United States Supreme Court case that established that the prosecution has to turn over all exculpatory evidence, is what they call it, but all evidence that might exonerate a defendant to the defense. And while that seems like while you're probably saying, well, why are you throwing this in here? Brady versus Maryland also deals with issues related to report writing and if anybody stretches the truth or lies in a police report. And the name for that, they call it a Brady officer. And what that means is if you get caught not being truthful in a police report, there's going to be some things that could happen to you. You could receive some discipline from your organization, depending upon the level of negligence, etc. But if it doesn't rise to the level of, let's say, you getting terminated or something like that, what happens is every time you testify in court on a report that you've written, the attorney has to tell the jury or the judge that you are a Brady officer, which means that you've had these issues in the past. So you can imagine how the jury would take that, knowing that you have been untruthful in a police report. So, there's a lot of things that can happen, but so this case law has kind of two pieces. One, it's your job as an investigator, report writer, officer, etc., to turn over all information, even if it's going to exonerate the person you arrested, because you're a fact finder. But it also moves a little bit further into truthfulness as it relates to your report. And what you don't want to do is get on the witness stand and testify and not tell the truth, because that's just going to create all kinds of problems, and especially when it comes to writing your report. So report writing is one aspect of the law enforcement profession that most officers kind of don't like. And I could probably ask the question right now, and maybe some of you are a little bit different than some classes that I've had, but there are people that really don't like writing. Just like there are some of you that are probably in this class that don't like public speaking. So these are a couple of little things that come out, but some of these reports, even though we're going to start off easy, can be extremely difficult and extremely detailed as we kind of go on down through the line, or when you get into law enforcement. And again, report writing is kind of one of the aspects of law enforcement that officers really don't like to do, or they are reluctant to accept? Anybody want to take a guess on why? Why don't cops like to write reports?
The amount of time it takes.
Okay, that's one thing. Go ahead, Dale.
Okay, well, from my personal experience when I was working as a security guard, I would have to write reports every hour on things that just didn't really mean anything. Like, I looked down here, there was nothing going on, and it was very mundane.
Okay.
But then there are times when I actually had to write something that took place, like seeing a suspicious person walking down the street. I'd have to write what time I saw them, where they were going, where they were coming from, if I made contact, what they were wearing. It gets very like specific and detailed, and it ends up taking like an hour and a half of just writing out.
Okay.
I saw a guy on the street.
All right, so you have time consuming, it can be mundane. What else? Anybody else have any other ideas? Why law enforcement officers don't like to write reports? There's kind of one other one out there. And if nobody grabs it, I'll go ahead and I'll throw it out there.
Couldn't they be called to speak on the report they're writing?
Well, and that's true. At some point, you may have to testify on your report, so that's definitely true. But there is something else, and it seems kind of simplistic, but really it kind of isn't. So at the end of the day, it's not very exciting. Kind of like Dale elaborated, kind of said some of it's kind of mundane and boring. Just writing stuff, and it's just it's not the exciting, cool stuff like going out there and looking for stolen cars and drug dealers and robbers and, things like that, right? So it's not very exciting, but it really is important because, as you said, you may have to end up going to court. And of course, your report is going to, end up in front of a bunch of other people, as we're going to see here pretty soon. So, that's one of the kind of important things to remember. And keep in mind that report writing is really an acquired skill, okay, that can be mastered in a short period of time. Most individuals aren't born a report writer. Yes, I know some people seem to have better speaking skills maybe than others because they can speak in public a little bit, or they might be a better speller or what have you, but typically you're not born a good report writer. So don't panic if you're not a good writer, because it's an acquired skill that's going to take practice just like anything else. And it's also a skill that, is going to improve over time with practice and experience, just like anything else. If any of you play sports or do anything like that, it takes time to get better, and the more you do it, the better you get. So, that's really important for us to remember. And as time goes on, you're going to need to develop a writing style that's comfortable for you, that you feel comfortable with, but it's also going to have to comply with whatever agency guidelines you work for. So if you work security, I'm sure there's guidelines on how you have to write your report or format it. They want this here and this next and this next. Same with law enforcement. Each department's a little different. It's kind of the same, but there's a little tweak, maybe from organization to organization. So, but as time goes on, you'll kind of find what fits for you. And honestly, the reality here is that, report writing, it really starts with the first officer on the scene and being able to secure that scene. And we'll talk about the investigative aspects and how that kind of leads into report writing as well. But the first officer on the scene has a lot of things that he or she must take care of. And there's a lot to think about and to do as the first officer on a crime scene, specifically as it relates to, homicide scenes like this. And if these photos look familiar, these are the O.J. Simpson murder photographs. And, when we kind of think about it, it's going to make sense why I'm kind of asking you the questions now, but what are some of the responsibilities of the first officer on the scene. If you were to roll up to the scene right here, as gruesome and ugly as this looks, what would be some of the things you have to do? Go ahead, Dale. I saw your hand.
To contain the area so that no evidence gets contaminated.
Okay, that's like a big one. And that really is one of the biggest thing if you're the first on scene, you really need to secure that. Safety is kind of a priority, but you want to secure that scene. Anything else after that? But that is an important one. Yes, you're going to...
Delegation?
Say that again?
Delegation, like figuring out who to call for what specific things?
Okay. At some point, if you're the first person on scene, you're kind of in charge until somebody relieves you or detectives come out or somebody else. So yes, you may have to have certain people do the canvas and have certain people deal with photos and that. So you may have to delegate. Yep. So that's good. What else? What else might we have to do?
Not contaminate the scene yourself.
Yeah, that's a big one. And it's while this isn't really a criminal investigation class, I'll kind of throw it out there. Anybody chew gum or eat sunflower seeds? These are like law enforcement's big bad things. I've walked through many crime scenes as a supervising detective coming out, and I see sunflower seeds inside of the crime scene because the officers were spitting them out. So Scott, you're right. That's a big deal. You're not going to want to walk through there and contaminate things. So there's a way to do that. So yes, we have to be careful that we're not contaminating the scene or accidentally removing something as well. So a lot of things for us to kind of do. Remember here that you've involved yourself in a situation that's going to require the utmost skill and professionalism in order to bring some type of order to this investigation. So you're going to be the first responder, take control of that crime scene and develop some type of course of action to resolve it. But part of that is going to involve, you writing. So as the first officer on the scene, your response to the incident, is not finished until that complete and thorough case report has been submitted and has been written. And just to kind of give you an idea, different agencies call things different. So some departments call their reports case reports. Some call them crime reports. Some call them incident reports. They're really kind of all the same. So really a crime report is the same thing as any of these. So that's kind of why I just made that notation. And I'll show you an example in just a minute. And we'll look at some different forms as we kind of go through this. And, it may be really easy to arrest somebody, but when you do, you have to have a case that you're going to be able to prove in court. And again, this is going to come down to your level of writing skill and being able to articulate what you see and using proper verbiage, etc., while still being objective and factual and everything else that really makes a good report writer. So the case report is critical in capturing every significant detail of an incident or a crime, etc. And the case report is an investigative tool that's utilized to find suspects and begin to bring some type of closure to a criminal incident. So typically you're going to write a report on any type of crime that's taken place or even a suspicious circumstance or something similar. And these are all important because this kind of starts the process, especially if you have a suspect in custody, of getting a report to the DA, and we'll kind of move into all that in a little bit. But if you've never seen what a report form looks like, here's just a couple of examples. And, it's a crime report, but it's also an incident report. And don't get scared by all of the just hundreds of boxes here. But I wanted to kind of show you what these look like. A lot of these are electronic forms nowadays. In the olden days, when I first started, you had to handwrite everything and actually had to spell. So you had to have a little pocket dictionary or you had to learn how to spell. Now we have spell check computers and templates and things like that we can type into. But still, the reason the case report's important is because it's got these face pages, as we call them, and basically they're data pages. because here is all of the information about the location and the time of the incident, and even the type of incident. Here's the type of crime. Here's your victim information. Here's your suspect information. Then you can go to the second page, and if you have more suspects or more victims, you can put them here. So you can see there's a lot of data, that, facts, excuse me, that are going to be pulled from these reports. If there are additional crimes, so additional offenses, is there property stolen or recovered? Is there a car involved? Are drugs involved? There's just so much. And then there's an evidence report that's at the end of this kind of 4 sets of pages, if you will, for any evidence that maybe you collected at the scene. So your standard case report, crime report, incident report typically will have these 4 pages. Not always, because agencies are a little bit different, but you'll have, we kind of call these face pages because their job is to collect all of the data. It's not the narrative part, it's not the written part, it's all the other stuff. And the reason you have this is because you want to be able to recontact your victim. All right, or the DA is going to subpoena the victim. You want to know where your suspect lives and the type of car they were driving, etc. You want to know if there's witnesses and how to get a hold of them. You want to know if there was evidence recovered at the scene. So there's a lot of different, bits of information that are collected in this case report. Keep in mind as well that the case report is a legal document which can be subpoenaed to court. And once you send your report off to the district attorney's office, it's already in court. But you could have a case report subpoenaed. And when you write your report, and someone mentioned this earlier, yes, you may have to go to court and testify about what was written in your report. So you really need to be able to defend what you wrote about the particular incident. And as we're going to kind of find out later, a lot of people are going to look at your report. And the defense attorney is going to do his or her best to find mistakes, and no one's perfect. If you write a report and you make a mistake, you just say, hey, I made a mistake there. That was wrong. That was incorrect. It needs to be this, or what have you. But you have plenty of chances to review your report, etc. But when it goes to court, you can definitely be sure that you could be asked a question about your report. Yeah, I see a hand. Dale, go ahead.
What if during the report writing, the information that you received during the incident changes? Like, you ask somebody something and they tell you it's A, and then while you're writing the report, it turns out that the information is really B, and the other person made the mistake. Do you have to document in the report that, hey, you were told at first it was this, and then later on it turned into that?
So there's 2 ways that you can do it. If you're still in contact with that person and they gave you, let's say, information that wasn't correct and they corrected it while you're still talking to them, that's okay. You don't have to indicate that unless there's a need to. Now, if you already write your report and you turn it in and then you find out that there's different information, you can do what we call a supplemental report, and you can just add those changes into your report. So basically you would write a little report, and I'll show you kind of what one of those looks like, saying, hey, on this day at this time, witness so-and-so recontacted me and clarified their statement as this. So yeah, you don't want to, once it's done and submitted, you don't want to just go in and change it, because then it looks like you're kind of being sneaky. So if it's already turned in, submitted, etc., then what you want to do is just add to the report with those changes. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that
Okay.
clears up.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So, when preparing your report, always be thinking about your courtroom testimony. You have to really understand that, hey, what I write here is going to possibly go to court, and I may get asked about something I write or something that I wrote. And I have a little question here, and then I'll kind of clarify that first statement. So let me ask the question first. Do you think that you're going to be allowed to look at your report during a court trial?
No.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I have a little bit of, so who said no?
I did it.
Okay, so how come?
Because it would feel like if you had the report right there with you, and the officers like using it, it's almost like they don't remember like what they wrote, or they don't remember like the facts, so it wouldn't look like professional if they were using it there.
Okay. All right. And who said yes?
I did.
Okay, how come?
You can use your report to refresh your memory about the incident that happened.
Okay. So here's the thing. Both of you are correct. What you don't want to do is you're not going to be allowed. So Lewis, you're right. You can't testify from your report. So you can't get up there and just read your report, because then you're right. You're not basically remembering the incident as it happened and what you were told, etc. But is it Moena?
Yes.
Okay. So you are correct as well. You are allowed under certain circumstances to refresh your memory. So you can't testify from your report. So you are correct, because that would just, you just be reading your report and you're not actually testifying from memory. But there are times where maybe this case was, 6 months ago and you're going to court and maybe you don't remember the exact address. Maybe you know the name of the business you went to investigate this, but you don't know the address. So you would be allowed to look at your report just for that specific aspect to refresh your memory. So great job. So you always want to, before you go to court, you want to read your report before you get to court, so that way you've kind of refamiliarized yourself with the case. Bring a copy with you, and when you go up on the witness stand, you can turn it upside down or you can keep it in a folder. And if the DA asks you a question that you don't quite recall, you could ask, I don't know, could I refresh my memory and look at my report? And the judge would either allow you or not. But typically they will allow you to refresh your memory. So really, really good questions, you guys. Note that, let me go back here. I talked about when preparing your case report, always be thinking about courtroom testimony. And here's a really good example. I'll use DUI so this is driving under the influence, as a really good example. A lot of officers might think it's kind of cool to come up with these really neat or different tests in order to determine if somebody is impaired while driving. So they might do the standard test, which could be, standing with your feet together, your arms out to your sides, tipping your head back, and then touching your nose with your finger. That's a standard test. Or walk the line. But I have seen some officers get themselves in a little bit of trouble when they put the test in there and they ask the person that's under the influence, okay, what I want you to do is I want you to recite the ABCs, but I want you to do it backwards. Now, I don't know about you. I'm pretty smart. I have like 3 master's degrees. I can't do that very well. I would have to kind of go forward and then go back. So you have to be careful what you put in that report, because it's going to end up being difficult to replicate. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So you never want to put something in your report that you really can't do as far as something like that. So that was kind of my thought when I was talking about, hey, think about courtroom testimony as you start to prepare your report and what might come about based on what you have written. Your case report is also a permanent record of everything that transpired in a criminal case or incident. This case report that we're talking about, crime report, incident report, case report, it enables others who were not at the crime scene to understand the facts that occurred at that scene. And this includes the judge and the jury. And there is kind of a saying out there, in the world of kind of legalese and courts, etc. If it's not written down, it doesn't exist. So it's important that you document everything, because if you forget to document something and you're asked the question and you didn't write it down, you can see the defense attorney is going to ask you, well, what, was it not important? You didn't write it down. And it's very difficult to kind of climb out of that hole. It doesn't mean you lose your case altogether, but it just doesn't look good. So remember, document. It's very important that you write everything down. All right, so who might examine your report? And it's important that we know who is going to take a look at this. Well, we know it's going to be your supervisor. So if you're an officer in training, it's going to be your training officer. It might be your shift sergeant, which would be your initial supervisor. It could be a lieutenant if they approve reports. So you've got that chain of command or command staff. Could be follow-up investigators, so detectives are going to read your report to determine whether they have enough information to kind of move forward on a case. Any officer of the court is going to look at your report, or could, and that would be a judge, a district attorney, a defense counsel, or even a juror, or the jury might look at a portion of your report. Sometimes the media gets a hold of portions of police reports, or they've been released, etc. So you can already see there's a lot of individuals that could look at it. Insurance adjusters, other attorneys. I mean, a lot of people can view your report. So again, stressing the importance of, accuracy, etc. And when you're writing your report, think about how you would describe all of the activities that took place, and we're going to learn a little bit of that. And remember, what are the elements of the crime that are going to help you prove your case? You need to know what that is in order to be able to meet those, that standard. Is it written in proper English? Poor word choice affects the meaning and understanding of a case report. So, and we'll kind of look at some examples. Keep it simple. Don't use complicated or sophisticated words when a simple word will work as well. Nobody really needs to know that you are an expert when it comes to communication, as far as your ability to spell phencyclidine or anything else. I mean, so these are, just remember who's reading your report. Not everybody is a Rhodes Scholar, etc. Okay? Were you careful of grammar and punctuation when you wrote your report? Sometimes errors can change the meaning of a case report. Sometimes you may need to clarify when you're talking to somebody. I always put in there, ask the question, how do you know? And here's kind of an example. When you go to a crime scene, it's going to be chaotic and confusing. And obtaining correct information is really, really important. You may need to clarify some information. So don't be afraid to ask whoever you're talking to repeat or clarify or even spell. And a simple example, and we'll go to the example here in a minute, but you could ask somebody, could I have your name, please? And it could be a female, and she could say, my name is Sherry. Well, you have Cheri, Cherie, Erry, Sherri. I mean, there's so many different spellings, and you need to make sure it's accurate. Something just as simple as that. So here's kind of an example that I threw out there. Here's a victim talking. I saw the burglar drive away in a 1995 blue Chevy Impala. Now, most of us really don't know. We could guess about a year or, of a vehicle, or if you're a car expert, maybe but I would ask them, well, how do you know it was a 1995? Or how do you know it was a Chevy Impala? Well, I used to own one. So you can at least clarify some statements. You don't necessarily have to put all of that in your report, but when you're getting the information, try to clarify things. And if you can't, that's fine. If that's just what they tell you, hey, that's what they tell you. But the more you can clarify information, the better. Each agency has, again, a specific format and style for, writing their reports and what's going to go inside their report. We're going to kind of focus on the common elements of writing a good case report. So just know that different departments might do it just a little bit different. And, understand that these elements can be transferred to any style and format that your agency may require. So we're going to kind of hit the basics, okay? So let's talk about style for your report. So the case report should be written kind of free-flowing type of document that reads as a story, but it needs to be factual. Use complete, simple sentences and paragraphs. Wording should be simple and easy to understand. Again, you don't need to use all of the really big, $10 words, if you will, or things like that. If there's an easier way to say something, then go ahead and say it that way. Okay. Eliminate needless words when you write. An example here is the car was blue in color. What's wrong with that statement right there? I mean, it's not wrong, but how could we make that better?
Just say the car was blue.
Yeah, the car was blue. We already know blue's a color. So a lot of times, and again, it's not the end of the world, but these are like little things. The car was blue in color. The car was blue. And that's really all you need to write. So this report that we're going to write, it's meant to inform and communicate information and not to impress anyone. We're not out to, impress the reader. We're out to identify facts and document facts. So keep it simple. Use plain and understandable English. Example, you may have to explain some of these. Infuriated. Most of us kind of know what that means, but maybe not everybody does. Outraged, furious, incensed, angry, mad. I mean, you may have to explain some of these words. So just know that if you use one of these, you're going to have to possibly explain. If you say, the suspect appeared to be angry, you can write that, but then the next question that's going to come out of the DA's mouth is going to be, well, what's that mean? What made you think the suspect was angry? So you're going to have to add a little bit more to your report. So hopefully this kind of makes sense. So you may need to explain some of this. Use the shortest words possible, again, as they're easier to spell and comprehend. Be concise, but be factual and be thorough. Okay. Again, if you use abstract wording, like in this particular case, you're going to have to explain it in your report. So if you use the word, the suspect was uncooperative, right away you should know that you need to explain what uncooperative, what did he do or what did she do that was uncooperative. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? Yeah, so you just have to take that extra step. The suspect appeared to be intoxicated. What made you come to the decision that that person was intoxicated? Go ahead, Scott.
Would it be smarter to simply just explain it as opposed to using the word, or does it work better to do both when writing a report?
You could do either, actually. I've seen it done both ways, and it works. I've seen officers, they say that, what we get a lot of times is the person, was combative. And then they go on to explain what made that person combative. So you could do it either way, works absolutely fine. Depending upon your department, they may want you to kind of do it one way, but I've seen it done both ways, and it's perfectly acceptable both ways. But that's a really good question, though. And so again, certain words, uncooperative, intoxicated, depressed, angry, belligerent, all of these are kind of abstract. So as Scott just kind of pointed out, we're going to have to explain that. So that way the reader knows what made us believe that person was depressed, or what actions did the person display that made me think that they were angry, etc. So just note the abstract wording. So again, kind of an example, don't simply state the suspect was uncooperative and belligerent. Explain what you meant by the words. And usually what it is adding on what they did. And usually that kind of clears things up. So either way is totally acceptable. So, and I put in some pictures just to kind of show that if, in your mind, just while you're thinking, we're not going to spend the time to go through it, but how would you describe this individual, as it relates to what's happening with him fighting with law enforcement? And these are things that we don't have to answer now, but just kind of for you to think about. How would you describe these things? Yelling and screaming, that would be a little bit easier. Certain actions that people are involved in, etc. But just note the abstract wording. Okay, some basic principles as it relates to kind of English and report writing, etc. Unless your agency requirements dictate it, it's usually almost always best to write in the first person singular style. And it just makes it simpler. A lot of departments do it this way. It doesn't mean that every organization does. You may work for one right now, whether it's security or this or that might want it a different way. But typically, we write in the first person. So it's I instead of this officer. So it's not this officer received a call, it's I received a call, because we're writing in the first person. It could be my partner, Officer Jones, and I received a call. It could be something simple like that. But when you kind of look at it, this officer received a call, it still makes sense, but it's not really the first person singular style. So the example I put, I arrived on scene at 3 p.m. and observed the victim, Mr. Smith, standing on the porch of the residence. That would be a complete sentence identifying who I am. I'm the officer. I arrived on scene and I saw this individual, Mr. Smith, standing on the porch. All right, past tense. You can write in past tense when writing reports as the incident occurred prior to the completion of your report. So if you're recounting events that have already taken place, then you can use past tense as far as that goes. But typically, just note that a lot of things are going to be written in that first person type dynamic. Keep your report chronological, okay? And that just means in order the best you can. So put your information in order as you observed it, you did it, you investigated it, etc. State what events occurred first, and then proceed forward on how things unfolded in sequential order. And a lot of officers struggle with kind of where to start their report. And if you kind of write your report in that chronological order, that'll really help you from struggling on figuring what to write first. And we'll get into some examples in a few minutes as we get kind of towards the end there. Use the active voice when you can instead of the passive voice. Putting things in an active voice is kind of an easy process. It's first identifying the action of the sentence, next identifying who or what is performing the action, and then finally put who or what is performing the action in front of the action. And I know that sounds confusing, but here's an example. Okay, so again, put the who before the what. So here's what you want to use. Sergeant Smith placed the knife into evidence. As opposed to, you want to avoid this, The knife was placed into evidence. Because what's wrong with this bottom sentence right here?
You don't know who's placing the knife into evidence.
Right. I mean, it's not going to destroy your report, but it's another question that's going to be brought up on, well, who was it, officer, that booked the knife into evidence? Well, it was Sergeant Smith. Well, shouldn't you have noted that, etc. So it's just another thing for us to kind of remember. You put the who before the what typically, and avoid these kind of ambiguous statements. Because, if something's placed into evidence, somebody had to do it. And that typically kind of makes sense.
Would it be fine if like someone put like who after, like the knife was placed into evidence by, Officer Smith?
That's fine too. For me, it's just easier to remember to put the who before the what, but you can do it the other way as well. So that's a really good question. As long as you're identifying who did it, that definitely makes it, that way we know. That way we're out of this kind of ambiguous sentence that says the knife was put in evidence and nobody knows who did it. And then we have to figure it out. The rule is kind of just, the who before the what, but your way works too. So either or would be satisfactory. All right. So good question. So remember, you're the fact finder when it comes to report writing, investigations, etc. Be objective. Use your 5 senses. Remember, you're allowed to use these things, of course. What you observed, what you heard, what you said, what you smelled, and what you touched. These are all things that, when you're conducting your investigation, etc., you want to kind of run through these and just make sure that you're kind of covering all the bases, and that'll help you with a little bit of report writing as well. As it relates to names, if possible, use the names and titles of involved individuals. And here's kind of some examples that I'm pretty sure will kind of clear this up. So I interviewed suspect number 1 who stated, and then they kind of keep on, and you say what they stated. So that's okay, because if we go back to the face pages where the little blocks are at, we know who suspect 1 is. But it's better if you say, I interviewed the suspect, John Black, who stated, and you don't have to repeat that every single time with the person's name, but especially at the beginning, you want to identify who this person is, because it can get kind of tangled up. All right, and here's an example of kind of the tangle that I'm talking about. Suspect 1 stated that suspect 2 had bought the gun and shot victim 1. Now, we could kind of weed through that and figure out, okay, suspect 1 was this person, and suspect 2 was this person, and victim 1 was this person. But for the first time, that if we're going to say this, wouldn't it be better to say, suspect 1 Jones, or, whatever, Jim Jones, whatever his name is or her name, said that suspect 2 put their name, had bought the gun and shot victim, and their name. And then after that, if you want to just refer to them as victim Jones or whatever, you could do that. But can everybody see how confusing this could be? If we just kind of talk in these numbers, it becomes very complicated. You know who it is because you wrote it. And again, we could go back to the face page and look and go, okay, suspect 1 is this person, suspect 2 is that person. That makes sense. But remember, people are going to read this and they're going to get kind of annoyed that they have to go back and figure out who suspect 1 is and who suspect 2 is, etc. So sometimes adding the name in there, at least the last name, kind of helps out. Okay. So it could be, you could do it like this. Suspect Black stated that his friend, suspect Jones, bought the gun and shot the victim, Tom Duggan. So you could do it like that. And I've seen them say suspect 1 Black stated that his friend, suspect 2 Jones. You could do that as well. But that first time, putting that name in there helps the reader go, oh, okay, I know who these people are. I know their names now, etc. And it just makes it easier for them to follow than just using the numbers. Okay, so a couple of other things. Again, once you've identified the players, again, so here's another example. Suspect 1, I put Mr. John Black. You don't have to. You can just say John Black. After you do that the first time, you can stop using suspect or victim, and you could just use their names. So some agencies will have you continue with just suspect Black or victim Duggan. So hopefully that makes sense. You kind of get away from using the numbers. So this is just general. Remember that different agencies kind of tweak it or do it a little bit different. But once you have identified each of the individuals, the players, you don't have to keep repeating victim 1, suspect 1. You could just say suspect Black or victim Jones if you're going to refer to them throughout the report. That's fine as well. All right, quotes. The use of quotes is something that you want to use, but you want to use it sparingly. A lot of times we tend to overquote. Use quotes when the suspect's statement is incriminating or you're going to lose the impact of the statement without it. All right, and I'll give you some examples. So you don't want to quote everything, but use quotes when the suspect, victim, or witness make a statement that results in a refusal. So if I need you to sign this form for your property, and they say something like, "I'm not going to sign that," and they, or denial, "I didn't kill that person." That would be a good quote because you really want that's an impact quote. Consent. Do you mind if I search your car? Suspect Jones said, "Yes, go ahead, officer, but you can't search the glove box." I mean, so all of those things. So waivers, confessions, denials, refusals, those big things that are impact, those would be great things to use quotes. Or spontaneous statements. If they just blurt something out to you or something similar. If they use, and I know that maybe some people don't like this, but if a suspect uses profanity or makes a threat, is that something that we want to quote? Absolutely. Do we want to quote it exactly as they say it? Absolutely. So thanks, Scott. I see you shaking your head. Don't say the suspect then began to use profanity, because that doesn't say what the actual person was stating. If they said F you, you this, you that, then you write it in quotes and you write it exactly as they said it, because that is an impact statement and you want to get all of that in there. Okay, so don't shy away from that. It doesn't mean you're a bad person because you're writing down profanity. It means that you're just writing down exactly what the person said or what their threat was, etc. So that's really important that you're right on target with that. Don't skimp and try to be nice to the person by not writing exactly what they said. Okay? And could you have to repeat that in court? The answer is going to be yes. There is a possibility that you may have to repeat that in court, and it just is what it is. So, quotes. Again, use quotes to avoid using subjective statements like the suspect used profanity, kind of like what I said. You want to capture their exact words. So if it's a threat, etc., you really want to put those things in quotes. Use quotes when using your own words might sound improper. Sometimes when you're dealing with sex crime victims, you're going to have to quote whatever it is that they say. So the example I put, a child might say the suspect touched whatever it was that they touched, and you're going to have to quote that. So just understand that that's going to be part of your investigation, and make sure you write that in your report, because as I said before, if it's not videotaped or audio taped and you don't write it down in the report, it really did people are going to think it didn't happen. So that's why this documentation is so important. All right, run-on sentences. One of the most common errors in a police report. And this type of sentence is one that goes just too long without helping to clarify the events being described. Especially with younger officers, I'll see a 2-page report and the second page narrative is like one humongous paragraph, like the whole entire page. As we're going to learn when we start to write reports, I'm going to have you break up these big long paragraphs into little headings. And that's going to make it easier for you to write your report. But try not to make these huge, long, run-on sentences. And it kind of goes along with police jargon. Remember, law enforcement officers have some unique words and phrases that are appropriate to use during certain times and activities in their daily routine, but not really appropriate to put in a report because people don't know what it means. And jargon is kind of a hybrid language used for a very specific audience and specific purpose. And a lot of different careers, they have jargon. It's slang, abbreviations, etc. Probably one of the, I'll give you an example that's not too offensive, but how about a tweaker? Does anybody know what a tweaker might be? See a couple.
Somebody who's on drugs.
Yeah, okay. Typically someone that might be using meth or something like that. So what you don't want to write in there is that the person was a tweaker, because people don't know what a tweaker is, and then you have to explain it. So again, you have to kind of get away from this hybrid language that sometimes we use, and law enforcement uses codes too. And we'll talk about that in a second. Remember your audience when you write your reports. You're not just writing for your buddy's not going to read your report. I mean, they might, but it's going to go to all these other people. Court officials, attorneys, jurors, they're going to all have access to your report. And it's critical that a non-law enforcement audience can read and understand what you mean. Okay, so using tweaker and basehead and things like that, we know what that might mean, or we've heard the slang before, but other people don't. So we want to make sure that we're not using all of that slang. And these aren't all the codes, but I thought I'd kind of throw it in there. This is Riverside Sheriff. And a lot of them are the same from department to department. Some are a little bit different. But you can see all of the different codes. So in your report, you don't want to say, I went 10-8 instead of, it's going back in service or something like that. You want to kind of say whatever it is. I responded to an 1144. People don't know what that is, or a 1044 unless you're in law enforcement. So you want to use regular language when you're talking. Now, there's a reason for codes. It's shorter. It's easier to, if somebody overhears something, they may not know what it means, which is good. So if somebody has a felony warrant, Riverside County would say 1032 Frank, which means they have a felony warrant, instead of the dispatcher coming over the radio and going, "Hey, Officer, Libert, your perp out there has a felony warrant," and then the guy takes off running. So you want to make sure that's why we use codes a lot of times. But we still want to talk and write in regular language, and you can see the different 11 codes, all the way down to responding to different from stakeouts to emergency response, etc. So these are things that we're kind of not going to put in our report. Go ahead, Dale.
Okay, so you have it as a police code 1044 as a dead body, and 1144 is a fatality. Aren't they the same thing?
A little bit different. So if you go 1044 could be, it could be a suicide. I know there's probably a code for suicide. It just could be a body dump, etc. And usually the 1144 fatalities, these are typically accidents. And things like that. So for us, I know, and RSO is pretty close to us. In Rialto, when I worked in 1144, was a fatal traffic collision. It was a fatality. So some of them kind of over, but either one of those is fine. But if you just had a dead body call in a residence or something, you would probably start off with, I've got a 1044 until you figured out exactly what it was. If it was a traffic collision, it'd be an 1144.
Okay.
So a lot of different codes. And then we also have the phonetic alphabet, which some of you probably know. If you're military, you have kind of the phonetic alphabet, and you might know a little bit of that. Different from LA County, maybe to Orange County, etc., but a lot of them are somewhat similar. And the rationale for the phonetic alphabet is so you can spell things and the dispatcher or whoever's listening would understand if it was like a very common name that could be spelled different ways. You would phonetically spell it. So, and you would use that. So, and you can see. All right, abbreviations. Most law enforcement policy and procedure manuals discourage abbreviations. As with police jargon, not every reader is going to know or understand the meaning of every abbreviation that's out there, and there are so many of them, and a lot of people sometimes just make up their own abbreviations. So what you want to do is you want to spell things out. So, unfortunately, if you're going to write down methamphetamine, you don't want to just put meth, because it kind of seems just a little, it's an abbreviation. You kind of know what it is, but it's not quite really to the level of professionalism that it needs to be. So if it's PCP, you don't want to just put PCP. You want to write out the first time phencyclidine, or methamphetamine or whatever it is. So on some of these longer words, at least the first time, you're going to want to write it out. But try to avoid abbreviations. It just kind of takes the question away. And again, not everybody understands every abbreviation. And avoid overcomplicating things, kind of like I've talked about before. The object is to communicate information. And here's kind of an example. The situation was exacerbated by the fact Mr. Lasher was using ambiguous phrases and elusive terminology. I suggested that he should take a moment and compose his equilibrium and then continue with the interview. Now, that's a little bit over the top, but there's some words in there that maybe some people don't understand what they actually mean, but you could really say this a little bit simple and even cut down on half of what you wrote. And I kind of changed it here. Initially, Mr. Lasher wasn't able to speak or communicate effectively. I suggested he take a minute and then continue in simple words. It said the exact same thing, but not quite as complicated as the writing that you saw before. So that's kind of trying to overstate something. So communicate as much information as possible, as clearly as possible, but kind of make it just the facts. You don't need to add all of the fluff. Again, avoid subjective wording if possible. There might be times you have to use it, but try to avoid it. Stay away from value judgments and give brief factual details. Objective wording is really essential when it comes to that. A couple examples. Mr. Jones had a motive to kill his wife as he had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy on her 2 weeks prior to her murder. Example 2, I discovered that Mr. Jones had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy from the Acme Insurance Company on his wife 2 weeks prior to her murder. Okay. Another example, just to kind of show you what we're talking about. I observed Mr. Jones hiding behind the teller's counter of the bank, fearing for my safety and the safety of others. I drew my service sidearm and ordered Mr. Jones to drop the gun. So, just again, example 2 isn't bad. Example 3 is actually pretty good, but again, just factual, non-subjective. Example 3 is fairly non-subjective. As we're kind of wrapping up for this part of the lecture, avoid conclusions. You can put sometimes opinions in your report, but you have to be a little bit careful. What you observed is a fact. Facts are what you observe, and based on information, etc. A conclusion or a deduction based on an observation could be an opinion or an assumption. Sometimes you can do that, but a lot of times they really don't want you to. So take the time to describe what somebody is doing, especially when it comes to use of force, etc. So here's an example, real quick. I saw the suspect breaking into the house. What's wrong with that statement?
You don't know how they were doing it?
Yeah, you don't really know how. So you saw him breaking into the house, but what made you think? I mean, the next question that comes to mind is, well, what was the person doing that made you think they were breaking into the house? So this is, it's too vague, right? It's kind of out there. So, you could be a little bit more detailed or a lot more detailed. I observed the suspect with a screwdriver wedged between the front door lock and the door frame. I observed him using a prying motion on the door lock, which appeared to force the door open. So that's just a little bit more. If you wrote this in your report, you probably wouldn't get a lot of questions. If you wrote this in your report, a lot of people are going to ask you, well, what made you think that? So hopefully these examples kind of help a little bit. Finally, proofread your report. It's important, that you really proofread it. And once you've proofread it, revise your report as you need it. Sometimes when you write your own stuff, a lot of times you think it's great. And you kind of go through it, hey, everything looks great. And then, take 5 minutes and then kind of go back and take a look at it. Sometimes it's easier to print the report out because now we type on computers to write reports, etc. So a lot of people, instead of looking at a computer screen to revise their report, they might print it out and look at it, hold it in their hand and look, and it's easier for them to see. Okay. Look at what it is. Review your wording and your grammar. Does your report paint the picture of what actually happened? Spell check. Make sure you spell check everything if you're typing on a computer, but also know that it doesn't catch everything. Spell check is good, but it doesn't always get every single thing, okay? Always remember that you're not the judge and jury. Your mission is not to prove a suspect's guilt, but to gather the facts and let the judicial system determine the outcome. Now, with that being said, you still want to put your best foot forward and as much evidence as you can to, run your case through the system, but you need to report all the facts of the case, not just those that point in one direction. So if there are some facts that might mitigate the suspect's responsibility, you still have the obligation, remember, under that Brady case, to make sure that you document everything in there, or at least let your supervisor or DA know that, hey, there's this information that needs to be looked at because it could mitigate the suspect's involvement, etc. Okay, so